Junipero Serra is currently one of the most controversial figures in American life. Who would have guessed it? I would. In 1987, Pope John Paul II was going to come to the fairground racetrack near Monterey on the grounds of the former Fort Ord and have a papal visit. And since it was so close to Carmel Mission, where Father Serra, when he died, he's buried right at the base of the altar, many of us incorrectly felt that Pope John Paul was going to canonize Father Serra and make him a saint. Our bishop at that time, Thaddeus Schubsta, Bishop of Monterey, asked me if I wouldn't sign a white paper saying from a historical standpoint there was no obstruction, nothing in Serra's character that would prevent his being made a saint. I see no obstacle from the standpoint of his character, but I see a great obstacle into what he stands for in relation to the Native American community. And I predicted that if Father Serra were canonized, he would become a major obstacle in the spiritual lives of many Native Americans. And furthermore, I predicted that there would be violence against the symbols of Serra. I'm sad, very sad, to see that I was so correct at that time. Why did this happen? Well, context is everything. To really understanding the complex historical phenomena that we're dealing with here. Serra was born on the island of Majorca, one of the Balearic Islands off the coast of Spain, really part of that greater province called Catalonia, of which Barcelona is the capital. And Barcelona is considered the most progressive city in all Spain. It's certainly the most industrial city, prosperous city. Over 1/3 of the gross national product of Spain is generated in the state of Catalonia. Catalonians had their own language, which may sound like Spanish and in its written form look a bit like Spanish, but it isn't Spanish. It is a different language. It reflects the different peoples who conquered that area over the years, most especially Visigoths conquered Spain at the end of the Roman Empire, who were Germanic people, and the Arabs came in, and ultimately they were driven out of the province by Charlemagne, and then they came back in again and ruled various areas of Catalonia for another 200 to 300 years. The islands were taken over by Mediterranean pirates at various times, occupied by the Moors. Like most islands, they were also isolated from some of the major events from Spain. So that when Father Serra was born into a relatively poor farming family in 1713, the whole area of Majorca could be said to be roughly 100 years behind the times of the rest of Spain and the rest of Europe. In fact, it wasn't even Spanish. It belonged to the French. It was only with the treaty that ended the War of Spanish Succession in 1714, Majorca and its neighboring islands became part of Spain. Now, Serra grows up, as I said, in relative poverty. His father grew almonds, and this was a central industry. By the way, the Spanish Padres brought the almond industry to California, which is an important component of our agricultural output to this day. Island was very good for growing almonds most of the year if you had sufficient rain during the rainy months. But when Serra was born, Majorca and the other Balearic Islands had undergone a 40-year drought where there was very little rain. And so it was a hard-scrabble existence. They had to borrow from the store just to have food on the table. Serra was apprenticed to his father as a farmer's assistant. The life of an apprentice, even though he was the son of the family, was not very easy. His father beat him regularly, which was very common amongst European families during that time. Violence was a part of his life, and as a youth, he saw men executed at the rack which was a horrible form of execution that in the days before the French Revolution was very common. The French Revolution, by the way, invented the guillotine to make executions kindlier. The rack certainly was not very kind. A man would be publicly tied to a wheel or to iron bars, and he would be beaten, usually by a butcher or a blacksmith, with an iron bar in his hands until every bone in his body was broken and his eyes bulged out, and he literally was begging to put an end to it. And finally the executioner would open his chest and pull his heart out. This is Western civilization. It's horrifying, isn't it? But it was a very common form of execution. Serra saw this, and let's say it put the fear of God into his heart. He knew the cruelty of his time. He wanted to withdraw from it, and so when he encountered the Franciscan monks for the first time, he was attracted to them, and his family permitted him to leave home in their small village and go to the main capital of the island, to Palma, where he entered a junior seminary. He did so well that he was promoted to the senior seminary. He was ordained a priest, and he was so good in his examinations in theology and philosophy that the Franciscan committee that interrogated him awarded him doctorates in each of those fields, and he became a professor in the Theologat, the higher school for Franciscans at Palma de Mallorca. He had very little field experience as a priest. His role was largely professorial. And yet, as he read the accounts of other Franciscans, beginning with St. Francis himself, he realized that this was not the way to eternal salvation. The life was too easy. He had a vow of poverty. He owned nothing. The seminary provided everything that he needed. There was brandy to drink after meals. There was good wine served with the meals. The professors were treated as they were at universities throughout Europe at this time, as very elevated persons. Serra's inner thoughts, as near as we can get them, and I can honestly and modestly say I've read everything that he wrote. I have in my office right near where we're filming this a collection in 9 volumes of the entire writings of Junipero Serra, both in Spanish and in English, and yet I find very little insight into what he was thinking at this time, but I can envision from my studies of Reformation history and such, which I taught for many years, that he literally was afraid that he might suffer the punishments of eternal hell unless he made some dramatic changes in his life. And he began to pray that he might become a true missionary for God, go out into the field of the heathens, and that's what they called people who weren't Christians. Gentiles literally means a heathen, someone who has not received the Word of God, and preach it and ultimately be martyred for this idea of being martyred. And the university that he was teaching at, the Llewellyn University, was named after a medieval saint who went to North Africa to preach Christianity to the Moors, which was a very dangerous thing to do, and he was in fact martyred there. So there were all these influences going on in Serra's life. In the 1750s, he had that opportunity. The aerial plains of Mexico had had a number of Native American uprisings 200 years and more after the Spanish conquest of Mexico. And so Serra was given the opportunity to go into a missionary area where there had recently been some uprisings that had been brutally put down by the Spanish viceroy in Mexico, an area called Querétaro. he is transferred there in a long and arduous voyage, at one point threatened by pirates just getting from the Balearic Islands, from Palma, to the seaport of Cadiz, where he was to be transferred to another vessel that would take him across the Atlantic Ocean to Veracruz in Mexico. That voyage from Palma to Cadiz was on an English ship where the captain was frequently drunk and at different points threatened to have the heathen Catholic priest thrown overboard and fed to the sharks. Serra endured this with what we'd have to say a good deal of grace. He arrives in Cadiz and prepares to sail to Mexico. It's a long, long voyage by way of San Juan, Puerto Rico. In San Juan, he comes ashore and he finds that many people in this fairly large Spanish-speaking city, most of these people were Indios converted to Christianity several hundred years before, had not heard a mass in perhaps 7 or 8 months. So he decides to start his career as a missionary by preaching to them. And he is wildly successful by all accounts. There were other people there writing about how people flocked to hear him and such. And he must have thought, this is truly what I was intended to do. He comes into Querétaro, and he finds that the Native Americans are living in great fear of the Spanish soldados, the Spanish soldiers. They had learned that the mounted soldier with his lance, finely tempered iron, almost steel-tipped lance, 12 feet long, could run them down. It could easily, one soldado could kill any number of Native Americans. Of course, there were the firearms, not particularly accurate, but certainly fear-inducing and such. And many of these Native Americans had seen members of their family brutally killed by the Spaniards. Serra intervenes, and he quickly learns that he can be someone who tries to stop the worst aspects of Spanish colonization. He never exactly says it, and I wish he had preached a sermon saying that colonization is wrong, but it's happening, and we are here to try to make it, shall we say, more kindly. That's not a very politically correct word to use in this, but I think that's what was going on in his mind. He never really fully articulates that. I think that's because he had to watch what he said, lest he be deported back to Spain by the Viceroy in Mexico City for treason against the King of Spain and his intentions. There was always this delicate balance between the priest and the military throughout the Spanish Empire, except for the Jesuits. But Serra is very, very successful in Querétaro, eventually founding 5 churches. And if you go back to Querétaro today, the attitude of the Native American population, the people who are called Los Indios, or the mestizo class, is very interesting. They hear of the anti-Serra feeling here in North America as Norte Americanos. Why are you so anti-Serra? We revere him here. He is a santo. And they were saying this years before Serra was canonized, that he tempered the military rule, he empowered communities, and left Querétaro in 1768 far better than he had found it in the early 1750s. And we have to consider that aspect of his character. Now, the opportunity to come to California presented itself in 1767 to 1768 with the expulsion of the Jesuit order from the Americas. In the 18th century, in the mid-18th century, the kings and princes of Europe fought a world war called the 7 Years' War, which bankrupted them. They needed money badly. The king, the pope, everyone needed money. When they went to the Jesuits, who had these supposedly these great treasuries from not only their schools but also for their missions in places like Paraguay, where they converted the whole country of Paraguay, and the Pope and the kings of Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was German, partly Spanish German, wanted money, and the Jesuits said, no, it's God's money. It's not your money. And so they were expelled. Well, the Jesuits had these missions in Peru, Central America, Paraguay, Argentina, Uruguay, and such, and most especially in the western part of the United States, where one Jesuit had come, discovered the sources of the Colorado and Gila rivers and went down to their confluence and found a path to the Gulf of California. And established a whole chain of missions from central Mexico going all the way up to Tucson, Arizona. And another band of Jesuits had gone up the California Peninsula from Cabo San Lucas to Loreto, north of Loreto, roughly halfway up the Baja California Peninsula, and established 18 missions. If you dismiss the Jesuits, and they were all arrested and deported from the Spanish Empire in poverty, if you kick them out, who will take their place? Well, the king appointed a visitor general to what was called Nueva España, New Spain, which is Mexico, who thought the Franciscans would be a likely order. So he contacted the provincial general of the Spanish Franciscans and asked if he would contact the Franciscan communities to see if they would come in and take the place of the Jesuits. Now, the Franciscans up to that point had not had true missionary experiences. A missionary experience is when you go into an area that had no exposure to Christianity whatsoever. Serra had been wildly successful in Querétaro, which had already been converted. He had to reconvert many people after the brutal put down of the uprising, but he had no other experience in this realm. Yet, when the opportunity came to volunteer to go to Baja California and then on to Alta California, he was very eager to go. He hadn't seen his family. He had just resolved he would never see his family alive again, only in heaven. And so he wasn't any risk taker. And remember, this is a man who really wanted to offer his life up for God. And he also saw an opportunity to be there at the beginning of the missions to try to alter the arrangement between the military people who were being ordered to expand the Spanish Empire and the Indios, the Native Americans. And he hoped to make a difference. When he sails across the Gulf of California, the Sea of Cortez, from San Blas, which is the main seaport for access to the Californians, when he sails across to Loreto, which is roughly midpoint on the eastern side of the Baja California Peninsula, he encounters people who are far more primitive than he thought. They had been converted by the Jesuits, and he had many loyal Native Americans there to assist him. And he is told by the Visitador General, Jose de Galvez, that he must now march overland up the Baja California Peninsula, just a few miles north of Loreto. He would be in land that the Jesuits had never converted, and he would go all the way to San Diego, where he would await 3 supply ships that would resupply him by sea. So it's almost a Paul Revere kind of enterprise. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea. There wasn't a third choice. But now the Native Americans in the San Diego area had contact with Cabrillo in 1542. They had had contact with Cermeño and Vizcaíno between 1595 and 1602-1603, but they had not seen outsiders since that time. Serra comes into this region, and it's the first time he has really seen man in his naked state. Climate in San Diego made it possible to live a good deal of the year virtually without clothes. They had tools, but they were essentially what we call Paleolithic, early Stone Age tools. In some cases, through trading, they had acquired Neolithic tools like obsidian knife blades. There was no obsidian in the San Diego area. Most of it was traded from tribe to tribe. But they were primitive people. They were relatively happy, although they were subject to periodic raids from neighboring tribes. They were broadly related to the people who occupied the Yuma, Arizona basin where the Colorado and the Gila meet. They had acquired some agriculture from those peoples, growing melons and pumpkins and other things, had a largely vegetarian diet, although their favorite food was termites from decaying trees. And of course that added to the Spanish view of them as being primitive. And Serra genuinely thought he was bringing them not only eternal salvation, but a better life on earth. The mission is founded what is now the Serra Museum, San Diego, in Mission Valley, where it opens up. You're only a few miles from the SeaWorld, the seaport, and that was where the first mission was founded. Soldados were left there with him as part of the expedition led by Juan Gaspar de Portola goes north to search for Monterey Bay, which the Governor General had said was to be the capital of Alta California in the late summer of 1769. Serra is there with a relatively small community. He sends best compadre or friend, Juan Crespi, with the expedition to look for Monterey Bay. His own leg had been bitten by a spider, an abscess to the point where you could see his bones, and he had a true odor of sanctity, according to others who were around him. Yet he insisted on walking. He slowed the expedition down. Finally, they had to persuade him to ride in a litter that was carried by Native Americans, and the expedition could move again, but there was no way that Portola wanted him on the expedition looking for Monterey Bay, where they had to make a requisite 15 or 17 miles a day if they were to fulfill their mission. So he's back there in San Diego with a small contingent of soldiers, and he begins to see the Native American women becoming objects of lust for the soldados. So you have the problem of baptized Native American women who you want to keep pure, and the soldados who were baptized and who were about to sin. The sin of adultery, all those other things were involved. And that's the moment where Serra decides to move the mission away from the soldados. And he eventually founds what is now the permanent site of Mission San Diego, way up the valley. For a slow walker, it's a good day's journey. I've walked it several times in my life, and it's taken me 6 or 7 hours, especially in the heat. So you're some distance from the main contingent of soldiers who eventually found what's called a presidio, or a fort at that site. Serra finds that's a very healing place. There are a few soldiers left with him who he could trust, and trains another priest, Father Luis Jaime, interact with the Native Americans in the same way, and they both see themselves as people who are trying to prevent the disastrous cruelty that's gone on elsewhere. Portola explored the California coastline from San Diego. They didn't find Monterey Bay, but they found a much larger bay, San Francisco, looking down from where Highway 280 goes up the peninsula just above Melbray, and the view is probably of runway number 3 at San Francisco International Airport. I often take people to that site on Sweeney Ridge to show them what it would have been. It was a vast bay that could have held the fleets of all of the major powers in the world. Portla knew that this was not Monterey Bay. It was in the wrong location. And the expedition turned around and began to go south. As they approached the real Monterey Bay, some of his officers said, you know, on the way up we had built a cross, the view that we thought might be Monterey Bay. This must be it. The earlier maps had to be in error. Naming the cross the Portola Crespi Cross, the expedition could say we have had success. Portola organized a second land and sea expedition to go back to that cross. Father Serra landing approximately where the old Presidio fort in the city of Monterey was located. Under an oak tree, he said the first Mass in what would become the future capital of California. He founds a mission in what is now downtown Monterey. The chapel for that mission is now called the Cathedral Chapel. Before that, it was always called the Presidio Chapel, because within a year and a half of founding it, Serra found the Native Americans being abused by the soldados. He moved the mission itself 7 miles to the south to what is now the city of Carmel. The Native American moved with him. Fages was very, very upset by this. He insisted on posting a guard at the newly founded mission. Those guards began the abuse all over again, and Serra finally had had enough. He writes letters to the Viceroy in New Spain, with whom he is personally acquainted, and he describes how the soldados who are so skillful with lassos can quickly lasso a Native American woman and take their pleasure of that woman. I recently saw an op-ed piece in our main newspaper, the paper that I write for, the San Luis Obispo Tribune, co-written by the Native American and a associate professor of ethnic studies at Cal Poly, in which they quote Serra as describing what happened to Native Americans as if Serra were taking delight in this. They took it completely out of context, because Serra was using this as an example for the Viceroy to order the soldados to stay away from Native American women. And finally, he charges the the military governor of California with the heresy. He says, you are permitting this, therefore you are a heretic. You're coming with me to Mexico to have a trial before the Inquisition and the Viceroy. And so Serra and Fages, the military governor of California, proceed down California, down what we now call the El Camino Real. It was seldom called that in its own day. But they proceed down by way of the Salinas Valley, and they arrive here in San Luis Obispo, where Serra decides unexpectedly he's going to found the 5th mission in his chain of missions. He had already founded a mission at San Antonio, which is roughly 50 miles south of Monterey and 80 miles north of San Luis Obispo. And the next mission to the south was San Gabriel in the Los Angeles Basin. And if there were going to be a chain of missions to make a sustainable transportation corridor in California, this mission had to be founded. He had been told he couldn't found a mission by Fages, but Serra says, I'm founding it here, and you're in effect under arrest. You can have no objection. So Mission San Luis Obispo was founded. We call it the accidental mission because of that. Father Serra wanted to found a mission at San Luis Obispo because it was nearby the Valley of the Bears. Those bears had supplied food for the original Portola expedition in 1769, and again in June of 1772, when the 2 missions to the north were literally starving, and Fages, the military governor, came down to Los Osos Valley and killed enough bear to send 9,000 pounds of dried bear meat back to San Antonio and Monterey. It had saved the day, and Father Serra thought, this is the alternative food supply for California. We need a mission here. That event is commemorated with Paula Zima's wonderful statue, The Bear with a Child. It's a reminder of the grizzly bears that roamed in the nearby Los Osos Valley. It clearly showed that Serra was in command at this point. They eventually get down to San Diego, take a ship to San Blas, and Fages is taken before the viceroy. He never faces an Inquisition court. That was a bluff on Serra's part. But he is told by the viceroy, you are being removed, and I'm going to appoint a new military governor who hopefully will be kinder to the Native Americans. When Father Serra returned to Monterey and Carmel, he was nearing the age of 60. The age of 60 in the 1770s was well beyond the average lifespan of a male at that time. But that didn't slow him down. Besides Mission San Carlos de Caramelo, he went on to found 5 other missions in Alta California. He planned one additional mission at Santa Barbara and managed to travel to Santa Barbara to found the Presidio. Mission Santa Barbara was founded 2 years after Serra's death. Despite his bad leg, Father Serra spent the last 3 years of his life traveling 600 miles, revisiting all of the missions and reacquainting himself with the people he had baptized, 5,309. This is one of the reasons why Pope Francis wanted to canonize Father Junipero Serra, because he was a great evangelizer. In 1784, Father Serra died at Mission Carmel. Father Serra was buried in the foot of what would be the chapel. The church at Carmel had not yet been completed, but Serra was buried in a well-marked grave at what was the planned altar at Mission Carmel, where he. Today at Mission Carmel, there is a cenotaph, a replication of a person lying in state, completed in 1924 by artist Joe Mora. It features Father Serra laid out, surrounded by 3 closest friends, Father Juan Crespi, who had died 2 years before Serra, Father Fermin Lassuane, who would be Father Serra's successor as Father Presidente of the mission, and Father Julian Lopez. Carmel Mission is visited by tens of thousands of people on a monthly basis. And it is a reminder of the struggle of this Franciscan monk in trying to evangelize California.